Okay, so you want to own a medieval bank. Gold florins stacked behind a locked door. Popes and kings who owe you money and who have to be careful how they speak to you. Now remember what the church taught about the trade you just bought into. The usurer sells what is not his to sell. He sells time, and time belongs to God alone. Lending at interest was not a gray area in 1400. It carried a name, and the name was sin. A man who died at it could be refused burial in holy ground, and his heirs could be stripped of what he left them. So the whole business came down to one question. How do you charge a man for time when time is the one thing you are forbidden to sell? Let's open one and find out. Florence. The year is 1400, and what you are building has a name. The Florentines called it a compagnia, a partnership with named shareholders, a written contract, and a table in a room off the street. That is the plant, a table. Within 30 years, a firm like yours can be running offices in Rome, Venice, Geneva, Bruges, and London. It will move more money across Europe in a year than most kings can raise for a war. It will help decide who gets crowned, who gets married, and which painters eat. And when we finally close the books on it, you will understand why the richest room in the business sat nowhere near Florence. Start with the vault, because the vault is the lie. Picture the room you just bought. There is money in it, and there is a great deal more of it than you were expecting. Almost none of it belongs to you. A medieval bank was not a pile of money. It was a pile of other people's money, and the entire art of the business was making sure they never all came asking for it in the same week. Here is what that looks like in hard numbers from a documented firm. In 1427, the Medici Bank's Rome office was holding roughly 100,000 florins on deposit from the papal treasury. The total capital of the whole Medici Bank, every branch, every partner, everything the owners had actually put in, was about 25,000. One branch was holding 4 times the entire firm's own money, and it belonged to somebody else. That is not a flaw in the design. That is the design. Your own capital is a thin cushion at the bottom. Everything stacked above it is a promise you have to be able to keep on demand. Now the second thing you're acquiring, and it is stranger, you are not buying a company, you are buying a term. A Florentine partnership had an expiry date written into it. The books closed, the partnership dissolved, the profits were counted, and then the partners decided whether to form a new one. The Medici settled theirs every year on the 24th of March. 6 months' notice and any partner could walk. So the thing you own is not a building or a name. It is a contract that runs out, renewed by people who are watching how you performed. And the third thing, which will matter enormously in about 20 minutes. Liability in a Florentine partnership was joint and it had no ceiling. Every partner stood behind the whole, not his share of it, the whole. None of this machinery was new in 1400, incidentally. From the 12th century, the Knights Templar had run something like it across a chain of houses stretching from London and Paris to the Holy Land. A pilgrim could hand over money in one country and draw it in another, and there was paperwork behind it. We know there was paperwork because of a complaint. In 1250, a French nobleman named Jean de Joinville had deposited 360 livres with the Templars at Acre. He went to draw 40 of it, and the officer in charge could find no record of the deposit at all. Joinville took it upstairs. 4 days later, the money was found. The idea was already 2 centuries old by the time you open your doors. And so was the ending. The Templar order was dissolved, and its assets were taken by the men who owed it the most. Keep that ending in mind. We come back to it in about 18 minutes, and it will not be a coincidence. What does it actually cost to become a named partner in one of these? The capital. In 1397, a man named Giovanni di Bicci de Medici moved his small bank from Rome to Florence, took on a partner, and put together 10,000 gold florins to open with. 10,000 florins does not sound like much until you understand what a florin was for. It was a gold coin, 3.5 grams, minted in Florence since 1252, and ordinary people barely touched it. Wages came in lira, and so did bread and rent and everything else a working household bought in a year. The florin was the coin of dowries, of international trade, and of tax, which means the first thing your capital buys is a category. You are not opening a business that ordinary money can reach. You are opening a business denominated in the coin people see maybe twice in their lives. Membership. You cannot deal in coins in Florence without belonging to the Arte del Cambio, the Money Changers Guild. One more fee, one more set of rules, and we are moving on. The premises. A table, a cloth, a set of scales, a strongbox, and a ledger. That's it. The Italian word for the table was banco, and it is where the word bank comes from. The most powerful financial institution in Europe was named after a piece of furniture. Clerks and books. Giovanni ran his books in Arabic numerals and double entry, at a time when rivals were still keeping accounts in Roman numerals. Every florin in, every florin out, in 2 places. So the 2 sides had to agree or you knew something was wrong. That cost money. It bought something no competitor had, which was the ability to know, on any given morning, whether you were solvent. And the float. This is the one nobody counts. You need cash sitting in the box doing absolutely nothing because depositors turn up. Money that sits is money that earns you not 1 coin. It is a permanent, unrecoverable cost of being trusted, and it never goes away. Add it up and the picture is clear enough. This is not a business a clever poor man walks into. Entry is the first filter, and it is a hard one. That is your bank then. 1 table, 1 strongbox, 1 city. And a bank in 1 city is not a bank. It's a moneylender with better furniture. Because here is the problem with everything we just built. Everything on that list you now have to buy again. Rome in 1397. Venice in 1402, then Geneva, then Milan, Pisa, Avignon, Bruges, London, Lyon. Every one of them needs premises. Everyone needs clerks. Everyone needs a partner on the ground you have to trust completely. Each also needs its own float, held in its own currency. That last point is worse than it sounds. Florins sitting idle in Bruges cannot answer a man standing at your table in Florence. Your dead capital doesn't pool, it fragments, and it fragments into as many pieces as you have cities. So the arithmetic of expansion runs the wrong way around. A second branch does not halve your costs by sharing them. It doubles the rooms you pay rent on, the clerks you pay wages to, and the pile of coin you are legally required to leave sitting still. A third branch does it again. Now imagine carrying that in 9 cities at once, every year, against 9 sets of prices, 9 tax regimes, and 9 sets of officials who have all noticed you. Worse, each of those cities contains a man holding a key you will never watch him turn. Which brings us to the thing that runs the network, and it isn't money, it's the post. Your inputs are 2: other people's deposits and information. Deposits arrive at the table, information arrives on a horse. Florence to Bruges is a matter of weeks, each way, in good weather and no war. That makes every instruction you send a decision taken in the dark. You are writing orders about a market you cannot see, to be carried out by a man you cannot supervise, based on prices that will have moved by the time your letter arrives. Which raises the obvious question. If a branch is that expensive and that blind, why open one at all? And the answer is the reason this business existed. You are not opening offices to sell more of the same thing in more places. The offices are the product. 2 tables in 2 cities that trust each other can do something 1 table can't do at any price. Which brings us to staff and to the strangest decision on the whole balance sheet. You do not put your branch managers on a wage. Think about the position you're in. Your man in Bruges is weeks away. He sees every deal before you do and long after you could stop him. Pay him a fixed sum and he has no reason on earth to care what happens to capital he can watch you fail to count. So you make him an owner instead. Below him you run the cheapest labor in the business and the slowest. Florentine firms sent boys abroad in their teens as Giovanni, juniors, posted into a foreign office to learn the trade in a language they didn't speak, on very little money, years away from being trusted with anything that mattered. Your training program is a decade long and it produces about 1 usable man at a time. A Medici branch manager was called a governatore, and he had to put his own money into his own branch to take the job. His pay came out of his share of that branch's profit. And while the partnership was running, nobody drew a salary and nobody drew a dividend. You waited for the books to close. Better still, the numbers were tuned to sweeten it. When the Venice partnership was renewed in 1455, the manager put in 2,000 ducats out of 14,000. On a straight split that earns him a 1/7 of the profit, he was paid a 1/5. The firm was quite deliberately overpaying him for his own money, to make sure his money was in there at all. It worked in the sense that it did exactly what it was designed to do. It gave you a man in a distant city who behaved like an owner. Here is the part that takes 40 years to arrive. It gave you a man in a distant city who behaved like an owner, with your capital and your name, and unlimited liability standing behind every decision he made on a Tuesday afternoon in a country you had never visited. One of the men who would eventually hold a job like this was a young Florentine called Tommaso Portinari. Remember the name. So far, this is an extremely expensive machine for spending capital in 9 countries at once. Here's where it starts making it. Ask anyone how a bank earns its living and you'll get the same answer. It lends at interest. Except you can't, and we settled that in the first minute, so cross the obvious answer off the list and look at what sits underneath it. The first stream is the exchange, A merchant in Florence needs funds in London. He doesn't want to carry gold across France in a war, so he comes to your table, hands you florins today, and you write him a bill instructing your London office to pay him in English money on a fixed date. Whatever rate you set today is not the rate your London man will use at the other end. That gap is your margin. And because currencies genuinely do move, you can stand in front of any churchman in Italy and say, truthfully, that you took a real risk. You didn't charge for time, you charged for exchange. The church accepted the distinction, and the whole of European finance was built inside it. Notice what does not happen here. Nothing travels. There is no cargo, no guard, no wagon, nothing anybody can steal on a road. The coin stays exactly where it is in both cities, and the profit happens anyway. That is the single most counterintuitive fact in this business. The safest fortune in medieval Europe was the one that never moved. The second stream is your depositors, who you also do not pay interest to. You pay them discrezione instead, a discretionary gift offered at year-end out of gratitude. Not a rate, not an obligation, certainly not interest, since interest would be a sin. Everybody involved understood it was a rate. It was reliable enough that people chose banks on the strength of it. But because it was legally a gift, your cost of funding was also, technically, a fiction. The third stream isn't banking at all. Alongside the bank, the Medici ran 2 wool workshops and a silk workshop as separate companies. In 1458, they had around 7,900 florins tied up in the 3 factories. Proper workshops, proper output, sold to the courts of Milan and beyond. A slow year in finance was not a slow year for the family, which brings us to the fourth. It is 1427. In a room that follows the Pope wherever he goes, a clerk is entering the day's receipts into a book. Money from England, money from Spain, money from every diocese in Christendom, collected as tithes and fees and dues, arriving in a dozen currencies, all of it flowing toward one court. And the court has no way whatsoever of moving it. You do. Rome ran the largest revenue-collecting operation in Europe. The church held claims in every country on the continent, and no machinery whatsoever for getting any of it home. It had no branches, it had no bills, it had no clerks who could tell a Flemish groat from an English one, so it hired you. Your senior post there carried a title, Depositary General, Fiscal Agent to the Apostolic Chamber, which is to say, the papal treasury. You held the church's money, you moved the church's money, and in the weeks and months between the day it arrived and the day it was spent, you lent it out. Interest never entered into it. There was no need to charge any because you were also selling him silk, brocade, jewels, and cloth, and you simply overcharged him on the goods. That office wasn't even in Rome, exactly. Internally, the Medici called it I nostri che seguono la corte di Roma, ours who follow the court of Rome. It went where the papal court went. When Pope Martin V spent 19 months living in a Dominican friary in Florence, the whole operation packed up and ran its business from there, alongside the Florence branch, which had never moved. Your most valuable outpost, then, had no fixed address, and its location was decided by wherever one man happened to be sleeping that year. Now the number. Between 1420 and 1435, as much as 62% of the entire Medici Bank's profits came out of Rome. Venice, the next best, managed 13. And remember, the Rome branch never needed capital of its own. It didn't have to be funded because the church was always depositing and hardly ever borrowing, which made the most profitable office in European finance one you barely had to pay for. You were not running a bank that happened to have a branch in Rome. You were running the papal treasury and taking a cut of everything that passed through your hands on its way to God. Let's slow down and walk one bill of exchange from end to end, because this instrument is the business and almost nobody explains it properly. 4 people, 2 cities, 2 currencies, 1 fixed period of time. A merchant in Florence gives you 10 florins today. In return, you write him a bill, and the bill says your London office will pay him in English money on an agreed date. That date is not negotiable and not arbitrary. Every pair of cities had a customary settlement period, called the usance. Between Florence and London, it was 3 months. Everybody knew it, and nobody had to argue about it. Now the rate. Say the bill is written at £0.50 to the florin. 10 florins becomes £5 in London 3 months from now. If the florin strengthens in the meantime, he loses. If it weakens, he wins, at your expense. The risk is real, both ways, and that is precisely what makes the whole thing legal. But run it back the other way and look at what you've actually built. You took money in Florence today. You pay money in London in 3 months. Somebody has your funds for a fixed period and gives them back with a difference on the end. That is a loan with a fixed term and a fixed return, wearing the clothes of a currency trade. And there was a version where the second leg barely happened at all. The bill went out and a matching bill bill came straight back to where it started, and when the dust settled, no goods had moved, no merchant had traveled, and money had simply been rented out for 3 months at a price. Everyone knew. The bankers, the merchants, the churchmen taking deposits, all of them. It held for 400 years anyway, because the risk was technically genuine and nobody could prove otherwise. Florence had a similar relationship with its own rules. Small-scale lending at interest was flatly illegal in the city. The penalty was a collective fine of 2,000 florins a year, and once it was paid, no further punishment could be brought against anyone for the sin of usury, which made it not a fine. It made it a license, sold annually, with a fine's name on it. Being rich in Florence had its own running costs on top. Forced loans on wealthy households, and from 1427 a property assessment called the catasto, which meant the commune knew exactly what you had. You could not be quietly wealthy in that city. Visibility was itself an expense. By now this looks like a machine that prints money. It was, for about 60 years, and it did it better than anything else in Europe. Here's the thing it could not survive. Your best customers are the people you have the least power over. A merchant who doesn't pay can be sued. He can be seized, blacklisted, driven out of his guild, and ruined. A king who doesn't pay is still a king. First time round, it took down the largest bank in the world. By the 1330s, the Peruzzi Company of Florence was the second largest financial house in Europe. 15 branches, from the Middle East to London, capital of more than 100,000 gold florins, and around 100 factors working under it. The Bardi were bigger still. Both of them lent enormous sums to Edward III of England to pay for his war with France. The figures usually quoted are 900,000 florins from the Bardi and 600,000 from the Peruzzi. In 1345, he defaulted. Both houses went down. 2 honest notes on that. Those figures come from Giovanni Villani's chronicle, and Villani worked for the Peruzzi and went to debtor's prison when it failed. He is our closest witness and also the least neutral man in Florence. And modern historians now treat the simple version of this story as too simple. The war with Lucca had drained Florentine silver for mercenaries. England and France were fighting over Aquitaine. Flanders had risen in revolt. The default was the blow that landed, not the only thing that was wrong. Then it happened again, to the family that should have known better. Remember Tommaso Portinari? He ran the Medici branch at Bruges. His articles of partnership put a hard ceiling on him. He was forbidden to lend more than £6,000 groat. He lent to Charles the Bold of Burgundy anyway in order to move closer to a court he wanted to be part of. He bought 2 galleys, which were sold off at a loss, wrecked, and taken by pirates. The London branch, meanwhile, had lent heavily to the losing side of an English civil war, to men who lost and died and never repaid a penny. No English king ever settled that debt. London was wound up in 1478 with losses of 51,533 gold florins. Bruges went the same year. Between the two of them, upwards of 70,000 florins gone, and that figure is the optimistic one because it assumes the assets were worth what the books said. Lorenzo de' Medici's comment on it survives, and it is pure acid. These are the great profits which are accruing to us through the management of Tommaso Portinari. Now watch the trap close, because everything in this episode has been walking toward it. Your man in Bruges was a partner with a profit share, judged on the business he wrote, sitting weeks of post away from anyone who could stop him. That arrangement was the only thing that made a 9-city network possible in the first place. And the liability, remember, was joint and had no ceiling. So one bad afternoon in Bruges becomes your bankruptcy in Florence, arriving by letter, weeks after it is too late to do anything about it. The design that built the bank is the design that killed it. The Medici were driven out of the city in 1494. And the church's own answer to all of this, the Monte di Pietà, the first one opened in Perugia in 1462, was a charitable pawn shop run deliberately at no profit, which is exactly why it outlasted everybody. Could you actually get rich owning one of these? A good year, and there were plenty of them, looks like this. Rome throws off well over half your profit on money that was never yours. Venice adds its share. The wool and silk companies carry the quarters when finance is slow. Between 1435 and 1455, the Medici Bank ran the best 2 decades any European bank had ever had. Giovanni di Bicci opened with 10,000 florins in 1397. When he died in 1429, his personal fortune was around 180,000. That is what a good run looked like from the inside. 18 times your stake across a working lifetime in the hardest currency in Europe. Household spending tells you the rest. Between 1434 and 1471, the family got through an average of 17,000 florins a year, most of a founding capital gone annually on buildings and art and the business of being the most important family in the city. A bad year is not a low number. That's the thing people get wrong about banks, then and now. A bad year is a morning. The books haven't changed, the building hasn't changed, but a letter has come in from a branch you cannot inspect, about a debtor you cannot compel, and outside your door there are people who heard about it before you did, standing in a line, wanting their own money back. And you are holding 4 times your capital in promises. Who got rich and who went bankrupt comes down to one thing, and it is not skill and it is not scale. The Peruzzi had 100 factors working under 15 branches, and the Bardi were bigger still. Both are gone. Every banker who died wealthy had lent to people he could take to court. Yes, then, and it is a real yes, not a hedged one. This business made one family the richest in Europe and bought them a city, 4 popes, and the Renaissance. But read the shape of it carefully. The banking made the money, and then the banking destroyed itself. What survived was everything the money had been converted into on the way past: land, offices, marriages, political control, and art that is still standing. Even at the end, the Medici Bank was the largest in Europe, 7 branches, over 50 factors. It went down anyway. Richard Goldthwaite's assessment of why is 1 line long: bad management. So yes, you could get very rich owning one, provided you understood you were standing on a bridge and not a destination. The Peruzzi failed, the Bardi failed. The Templars were dissolved and stripped by their own debtors. The Medici Bank was wound up branch by branch, and the family was thrown out of Florence in 1494. Every institution in this episode is gone. The instrument outlived all of them. The bill of exchange, the trick built to charge for time without ever admitting it, went on working for 400 years after the last of these banks closed its doors. And the argument that made it legal is still the argument every financial product makes when somebody asks whether it is really what it claims to be. You were never buying a bank. You were buying a seat at the table where that argument was invented. And the argument turned out to be worth more than the bank.